Welcome to Georgia's Old Capitol Walking Tour. I'm Sherrill Jones, and I'm going to take you on a video walking tour today, thanks to the talented and creative production staff at Georgia College and State University. When I first came to Milledgeville in 1965 as a freshman at the Women's College of Georgia, I had no idea that I would make this my permanent home, and that after 30 years as a public school educator, I would become a volunteer trolley guide. Now, our trolley and walking tours begin right here at our Convention and Visitors Bureau, which happens to be housed in a 1911 building that was originally constructed as a post office. And it served as our local post office until 1961, when a larger building was constructed. And at that point in time, it became our public library. But as libraries do, the space became too small. A newer library was constructed, and in 1986, this building became our official visitor center. We welcome visitors here. And before we actually begin our tour, I want to give you a little bit of background information about Milledgeville. Milledgeville was Georgia's planned capital city. We were the fourth capital of the state of Georgia. The first capital was over in Savannah. Later it moved inland to Augusta, and then in the late 1700s it moved further inland to Louisville, Georgia. However, after the Treaty of 1802, known as the Treaty of Fort Wilkinson, which happened to be a treaty between the U.S. government and the Creek Indian Nation, land west of the Oconee River became available. Now, the Indians, as a result of that treaty, had to cede over 1 million acres of land. And I use the term cede very loosely because, in truth, we coerced the Indians into relinquishing that vast amount of land. Well, once that happened, the Georgia legislature passed legislation, and this took place in May of 1803, to identify a specific site and survey land to become a capital city, to be named Milledgeville for then Governor John Milledge. They identified the site for two reasons. One, its close proximity to the river, which was the main source of bringing in supplies at that period of time. And secondly, because there were 8 natural springs in the vicinity, and that made drinking water readily accessible. Well, once they identified the site, they surveyed approximately 500 acres. They laid the streets out in a checkerboard-like fashion, running north, south, east, and west, forming 84 4-acre business or residential squares and 4 20-acre public squares. Now we're going to take a look at the first of those 20-acre public squares. The property directly across from the Visitor Center is one of those 20-acre public squares. This particular square was designated as Penitentiary Square during the Old Capitol period. Today, it is the main campus for Georgia College and State University and has been since 1889. On the corner of the property is our former Baldwin County Courthouse, a building that dates back to 1885, and it sits on the site of an earlier courthouse that burned. It served as the county courthouse for over 100 years, prior to the building of another courthouse, which is just across the street from it. And that one was opened in 1996. At this time, we're going to turn and begin our walk up Hancock Street, headed east toward the river. We're at the intersection of Wayne and Hancock Streets, where we're going to view the Masonic Hall. This is an 1834 high Federal-style building. It was built by the architect John Marler, and you're going to hear his name a good bit later on the tour today. It's a brick building. We see that it has 3 levels. All 3 have double doors with fan-shaped windows above the doorways. The second and third floors have cantilevered balconies, and the balconies are supported by brackets that contain the compass and square. And then if you'll take a look at the windows up on all three levels, you see that they are surrounded by granite trimming. And then the roof line has an entablature with varying size brackets. Lots of detail in the building, and inside, what you can't see from out here is that it has a freestanding spiral staircase that goes all the way to the third floor. The Masons here in Milledgeville do still meet in the building on the third floor. Next on our tour is Sacred Heart Catholic Church, which happens to be at the intersection of Hancock and Jefferson Streets. Now, Sacred Heart dates back to 1874. When the church was constructed, it was built on the former site of a three-story brick hotel called the Lafayette. The Lafayette burned in 1858, and when the parishioners built their church, they recycled the brick from the earlier hotel, as well as those arched window frames. This also happens to be the home church of the family of Flannery O'Connor. And during the last 13 years of Flannery's life, and for those who don't know, Flannery was a Southern short story writer, and I'll tell you a little bit more about her later. But this was her family's church, and during the last 13 years of her life, she and her mother attended Mass almost daily at the church. We're now standing in front of the restored State Capitol building. This is on another one of those 20-acre public squares, the one designed specifically for the State House. The building directly in front of us is actually a reconstructed building. The original State House was just a rectangular-shaped brick building ready for occupancy in 1807. Then between 1820 and 1830, the state decided to enlarge the building, and it gave us the look that we have today. Now we're going to stop and make our way up to the State House and talk about some of the details of the building. A little bit of our history that's taken place in this building covers three fires. The first of those fires was in the 1830s during a legislative session, and the building caught fire from an ember from one of the fireplaces. Well, when that happened, the members of the legislature evacuated, they ran out, they formed a bucket brigade. Everybody from all around came to help them, but they were having no success putting out the fire. A local enslaved man named Sam Marlowe voluntarily climbed a ladder, crawled out on the roof, and contained the fire. And once he extinguished it, he then took his bare hands and tossed the remaining burning embers and saved the building. And for that act, members of the legislature collected from among themselves the $1,600 to buy his freedom. Now, the second fire in the building occurred in the late 1800s after this had become the property of the college, and at that time the building was gutted. Well, they rebuilt, and then the third fire was in 1941. Once again, the building was gutted. By the time our state legislature had appropriated funding to rebuild, we were in the midst of World War II, and that meant a couple of things. One, material resources were scarce, and so was local labor, skilled labor. As a result, the materials used were of a poor quality, and the labor was local prison labor. Well, in 1998, the president of the college, who just happened to be a retired U.S. Army general, successfully lobbied our state legislature for $10 million. And when that happened, they came in, they gutted the building once again, and this time they stripped the stucco from its facade so that all we had was a brick skeleton in our midst. And then, of course, by the year 2000, we had a new, beautiful, reconstructed building. And incidentally, this building and the property happen to be in the National Register of Historic Places. Okay, we're going to now turn and look across to the west of this building towards St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. I want you to take a look at a tree that has a concrete encased wall around it. This is the approximate location of an arsenal that was on the property in the 1800s. And in November of 1861, Milledgeville had an unwanted visitor, if you will. General William T. Sherman made a stop here, and one of his departing acts was to blow up the arsenal. And when the arsenal exploded, the roof on the sanctuary of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church blew off, and that's the church that is just beyond the tree. The tree, however, was planted in 1921 by the Daughters of the American Revolution to honor World War I veterans. And at the time that it was planted, they wrote to the existing 48 states and asked for soil donations, and every state responded. Later, when Hawaii and Alaska became states, we asked for soil donations from them as well. Consequently, all states are represented around this tree, and it's referred to as Milledgeville's Liberty Tree. Okay, we're standing in front of St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. The church dates back to 1843. This is the church that lost its roof when Sherman came through. And the portion of the church that was here then is simply just this small section that you see with a pretty red door. It's the sanctuary. And immediately after the war, the parishioners put a flat roof on the church, and then they saved money, and about 5 years afterwards, they were able to put the lovely roof that you see today. And the carpenters who were hired to do it were definitely experts. And the architecture today is referred to as Carpenter Gothic. On our trolley tours, we're able to go inside the church and see the wonderful work that these skilled craftsmen did. And I'm sorry we can't do it today on the walking tour. So you just have to come back to Milledgeville. Now, I want to go back to Mr. Sherman's visit to Milledgeville. This was in November of 1864. It was after the famous burning of Atlanta. He divided the 60,000 men who were with him into 2 wings to make their way to Savannah, the famous March to the Sea. And of course, one of those wings came through the old state capitol. We like to say in the Capitol that General Sherman did not get a warm welcome because we happen to know that weather conditions were terrible. There was ice, sleet, even some snow flurries. Now, it meant that they had to camp out at night, and to keep the campfires going, they did go through town and take down outbuildings and fences. They also came into the sanctuaries of the churches here on the State House Square and removed the pews to fuel their fires. And inside St. Stephen's, once you've removed the pews, you have a big open space which happened to be perfect for harboring horses. So Sherman's horses spent a night or two inside the church sanctuary. Another event that took place while he was here relative to the church is that his regiment, who happened to be from New York State, camped out right here on the State House Square. My take is that particular regiment consisted primarily of young men, maybe even some teenage boys, because they did something extremely mischievous. They got their hands on a barrel of molasses, brought it in, poured it down the pipes of the organ, and isn't that something a teenage boy would do? At any rate, after the war, the parishioners cleaned the pipes, but they were never able to remove all of the syrup residue. And as the organist would be playing along, suddenly, a bad sound or no sound. And this was going on as late as 1909. And in 1909, the organist was a fairly accomplished musician, and she was highly frustrated. Her husband happened to be employed by the local branch of the New York Life Insurance Company. And obviously, he was trying to work his way up their corporate ladder because he managed to succeed in convincing his wife to name their second daughter Nylic. Strange name. Nylic is spelled N-Y-L-I-C. New York Life Insurance Company. Well, this little darling named Nylic was 11 years old in 1909, and she took it upon herself to write a letter to the New York Life Insurance Company president. And in this letter, she described for him what the Yankees had done to the organ in their church. She told him that her mother, who was the organist, was highly frustrated, and she concluded her letter with a statement to the effect that she thought he should do something about it. Well, believe it or not, this CEO in upstate New York did a little bit of research, decided that Miss Nylick knew what she was talking about, and he then sent a one-sentence telegram which stated, "Buy an organ and send me the bill." St. Stephen's still has that telegram, and it's on display in their Warden's Hall. I hope that one day you'll visit Milledgeville and that we'll go inside and see this lovely sanctuary. We're now on the corner of Green and Wilkinson Streets, and behind me is a house that was built in the 1820s by John Marler, the same architect who did the Masonic Hall. And this particular one is known as 13 Columns because it has 13 columns. It originally was a boarding house, and the entrance that you see from this side of the street is the ladies' entrance. And notice it has a leaded fan-shaped window above the doorway. And in a minute we'll move in front of the gentleman's entrance, and you're going to see that it does not have a leaded fan light. Instead, it has what is referred to as the Marler block. We're now in the middle of the block on Green Street, looking toward the Klein O'Connor Flooring Court house, and it happens to be located on the 4-acre square with the old governor's mansion, and it's directly behind the governor's mansion. I first would like for you to look at this beautiful brick fence. At one time, the entire square was circled with this particular fence. The only remaining aspect is the section that is here with the Klein O'Connor Flooring Court house. This house is important to our area for a couple of reasons. One, it was leased by the state of Georgia during the 1830s while the old governor's mansion was under construction. And then secondly, it's important because it was the family home of Flannery O'Connor's mother's family. Later, when the O'Connors moved back to Milledgeville, they moved in with Flannery's aunts who lived in this house. Sadly, Flannery, again, who was a Southern short story writer, came down with lupus, a disease that she inherited from her father. He also had lupus. They came to Milledgeville when Mr. O'Connor was dying. Flannery was about 13 years old. She went to high school here at Peabody High School, which was it was a lab school for Georgia College at that time, which was the Georgia State College for Women. This was her mother's home, and later in life, when Flannery came down with lupus, she returned to Milledgeville and spent her last 13 years in town. However, they moved from this house out to the farm called Andalusia because Flannery had difficulty with the stairs. Sadly, she passed away at the age of 39 in 1964. Her mother lived to be 99 and passed away in 1995. Now, the house is Federal in style. However, in a minute, our cameras will show you that it now has a standing seam metal roof, a widow's walk, and also a Victorian addition on the side. We're now on Liberty Street. And Liberty Street is a street that runs between Penitentiary Square, which is where Georgia College is today, all the way down to another one of the 4 20-acre public squares. And while this particular square was originally designated to be for churches and academies, today it is a city cemetery, and it happens to be one of the oldest established city cemeteries in Georgia. And there's an interesting tale that goes with the name of Liberty Street. And although it's really just a tale, it's sort of fun to share. And that's the fact that it was named Liberty because when prisoners died, they were finally liberated and moved down the street to the cemetery. That's not, in fact, the real reason it's named Liberty Street. Originally, all the streets in Milledgeville were named for Revolutionary War heroes except for 2, Liberty and Columbia, and those names had patriotic connotations. Now, directly behind me is an important house to the area. It's a Federal-style house. It has a long, narrow front portico. This happens to have 4 columns that are tapered. And then if you look at the pediment above, you see a raised sunburst or a raised fan. And of course, it has a lovely cantilevered balcony. Those are some of the elements associated with the Federal style. This particular house was originally quite small in that it was 2 rooms over 2 rooms with a central hallway. But it's interesting to note that its first occupant was a local physician who happened to take care of the patients at the prison. And believe it or not, his name was Dr. Payne. Now, Memory Hill Cemetery is on the site of another one of those 4 20-acre public squares. And I think I've already mentioned that the original plan is that churches and academies would be located here. However, the only church to ever build here on the original 20 acres was the First Methodist. And this was in 1809. Shortly after, they started a little graveyard around their church, but when it became evident that none of the other churches would build here, the state decided to allow any church that wanted to build on the State House Square. So when General Sherman made his visit to Milledgeville, there were actually 4 churches on the State House Square: the First Methodist, the First Baptist, the First Presbyterian, and St. Stephen's Episcopal Church. Today there are only 2, the Presbyterian and St. Stephen's. When the churches moved to the State House Square, the city decided to make this a city cemetery. We're now standing in front of Flag Chapel Baptist Church. Flag Chapel Baptist Church was founded by Wilkes Flagg, the man who was enslaved by Dr. Tomlinson Ford. Flagg was an amazing individual. I've mentioned that he was able to buy the freedom of his wife and his son. By the time of the war between the states, he was a man of wealth, having amassed an estate of about $25,000. He was a highly religious individual, and he started the first African-American Baptist church, and it was on this site. This is not the original building. The earlier building burned in the 1970s, and when it burned, the bell from that building was placed here on the side with a marker indicating the graves of Wilkes Flagg and his wife. And Flagg was highly respected within the entire community. He served as a steward at the governor's mansion whenever there were special events. After the war, he gave property behind this building to the Freedmen's Bureau to establish the first African-American school in the area. It was called the Eddy School, and sadly it too burned to the ground, not once but twice. And I'll tell you a little bit more about one of its famous alums when we move up the street. We're now on Clark Street, standing in front of the Sally Ellis Davis house. Sally Ellis was born in 1877, the daughter of an Irish farmer and his African-American common law wife. At that time, the anti-miscegenation laws did not allow for interracial marriage. Sally attended school back here behind Flag Chapel at the Eddy School. After graduation, she went and attended Atlanta University, got her teaching degree, came back to Milledgeville, became a teacher at the school, and was eventually its principal. After 51 years as an educator, she retired, and sadly, 6 months later, she died from cancer. The house today is owned by Georgia College and State University, has been fully restored, and it contains our African American Heritage Museum. I'm standing here on the median in Washington Street, in the section between the Sally Ellis Davis house and behind me, the Major Edward White house. Now you need to know about Washington Street. Washington Street connects the State House Square with our 4th 20-acre public square. This particular one was called Governor's Square, And the original plan for the city is that the governor's home would be built here. However, that never happened because this was a swampy, forested, mosquito-infested area. But had the governor's home been built on this square, then each morning he would have left home, proceeded along Washington Avenue, straight to the State House Square, very much like the president does in Washington, D.C., from the White House to the Capitol. Okay, behind me is the Major Edward White House, and this is considered to be the oldest house in the historic district. And Major Edward White served as adjutant to the Marquis de Lafayette during the Battle of Yorktown. And interestingly enough, today, this is still a private home. It is not on its original site. It has been relocated, but it is owned and occupied by a descendant of Major White's family. We're now on the corner of Clark and Green Streets, and behind me is the Sims house. And it dates back to 1824. When it was originally constructed, it was a Federal-style house with 4 columns. Today, it is a neoclassical style house with just a few more. And the tale associated with it is that the lady here at this house was upset that there was a house down the street with 13 columns and she had just 4. So guess how many we now have? Yep, 14. You gotta have one more. We're going to end today's video walking tour here at the old Governor's Mansion. This is Milledgeville's Grand Lady. She dates back to 1839, High Greek Revival style. And like the State House, it is a brick structure with a stucco facade that's been scored to appear as if it's block or stone. And of course, this has a bit of a pink hue in it because it has a little bit more of our Georgia red clay in the pigmentation. Now, you'll have to come to Milledgeville and explore inside the old Governor's Mansion. Those tours happen to still be operating right now. I hope that you've learned some things today, and believe me, this is only a sampling of what our trolley tour is like and what our other walking tours are like. I've not touched on the Marquis de Lafayette's visit to Milledgeville in 1825. I haven't told you about the Big Indian Tavern. I haven't explained about Governor Jared Irwin's trip to Milledgeville from Louisville in 1807. We have more stories and more properties to visit. So please, at some point soon, I hope you'll visit and take our walking tour, and maybe sometime in 2021, we'll be offering our trolley tours again.